Hey everyone, on behalf of the Issam Institute, I'd like to thank you for coming. Today's lecture is entitled, Why Does Social Policy Matter for Lebanon and the Wider MENA Region? Given by Dr. Rana Jawad. Dr. Jawad, hi. Dr. Jawad is a lecturer in social policy at the University of Bath. She has regional interests in the Middle East and North Africa and has various publications in this field, including her 2009 book, Social Welfare and Religion in the Middle East, a Lebanese Perspective. She's founder and current convener of the MENA Social Policy Network, which is based at the University of Bath. Please join me in welcoming her.
طيب اوكي مرحبا كيفكم؟ سوري بدنا نحكي بالانجليزي بالبرزنتيشن بس كلنا الوركينج لانجويج ان انجلش بس ثانك يو فيري ماتش انكم عزمتوني. لي الشرف انه اتعرف على هنا وعلى نادين. انا بتابع اخبار الاي اف اي من زمان لاني عم ببحث على اشخاص تانية بيشتغلوا على موضوع السياسه الاجتماعيه. I'll speak in English in a minute just in case. فاit's really nice انكم تعزموني and I hope انه this is a long conversation. More than a conversation, but certainly it's great to be here. Thank you very much. A nice surprise to see some friends I've known for a very long time. So just in case, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to have made contact with Hannah and Nadine. I'm well aware of the Issam Faris Institute, and I've been following its news for several years since its establishment because I've been actively looking for possible partners, colleagues, friends in the MENA region who have an interest in social policy issues, and it's great. So it's very nice that it's coincided, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's late in the afternoon, so hopefully I won't speak for too long, but equally I hope that you will find what I have to say of interest. I'm sure I will present the usual sort of discussion that you might expect about my research, but for me, personally, and I think to make it all meaningful, it's important to start a conversation. And I think the conversation about social policy is very much one among researchers, as it is researchers working in the Middle East and North Africa region and in Lebanon. So there is a research agenda, and I see that as being very linked to change on the ground. You may think I'm mad. I will probably sound very old, and I probably might be because next year is a milestone birthday for me. But since I started working in this field around 15 years ago, I was very much, from my perspective anyway, a lone ranger, coming from a social policy background in the UK and having had Lebanese parents who drummed into me that I was Lebanese and I had to remain attached to Lebanon. I've always had an instinctive interest in the Middle East and North Africa region. So the two came together, and they are very much unlikely bedfellows. And that's very much a source of personal and professional frustration for me, as I'm probably sure it is for you, that sadly this region generally, whether it's in policy or research debates, is primarily of interest because of geopolitical and of international security issues, the oil, production of oil. These are the dominant debates, Islamic terrorism, and, you know, other factors are completely overlooked, which are the social dimensions of this region, the institutional makeup of this region, both in historical and in contemporary perspective. And that sort of perspective has been missing. So it's been over a decade, but I think, you know, the sort of the groups of people are growing, and I think that perhaps it's a shame that it took something like the Arab uprisings to make donor agencies and regional governments wake up to the importance of social justice issues in this region. But equally, you know, time is not lost. And it's important that we recognize that, you know, the concern for peace in this region is very much connected with the concern for social justice. So social policy matters a lot, and I hope that, you know, we start a conversation which will continue, and, you know, in a variety of fields. So there's a bit of a long introduction, But I think it's important to set the scene, because I think that a lot of the issues that we may be researching about directly relate to us individually and to, you know, how we live in this region and what perspective we have on it. And I think that perhaps this is what is of interest when we talk about social policy or when we talk about social protection. Right, so just back a little bit to the presentation. Just a bit of an overview, not to be a bit too pedantic, but I think it'd be interesting just to, you know, I'd like to hear what you think as well, what you think social policy means, and I'll just sort of share some of my thoughts on social policy, what it means as an academic subject, but equally as an arm of government. I'll share with you some information about the research that I've been doing over the last few years, and this is sort of my last trip to Lebanon as part of a particular phase of the research, but hopefully will come again. But just, you know, for you just to let you know the kind of research that we're doing, it may be of interest to you. And then just to touch a little bit on the policy changes in a way, partly in response to the Arab uprisings, but also the Millennium Development Goals. The targets for those have come to an end, and, you know, the UN and World Bank and all the big actors in sort of the field of development policy are looking for a new discourse. So we have this concept of social protection, which has been floating around now for quite a few years. So quite a few things have come together. Policy debates or trends, historical trends have come together, and this whole sort of issue of social policy seems to have become relevant. So I'd like to just touch a little bit on that, and just to discuss, well, you know, what already exists in the MENA region, Lebanon included, in terms of what we might call social policy. What does it look like? Because there is already social policy in this region happening. And it's been happening for as long as countries in this region have been nation states. So just thinking a little bit about what the achievements of those are and what the implications might be. Okay, and feel free to interrupt me and ask questions at any time if you like. So why do I think that social policy is an important term? You may think this is a little bit elementary, but perhaps a little bit of the scene setting that I did helps to clarify this. I don't think there is enough research on the social, what we might call the social, vaguely speaking, in the MENA region, in the Middle East and North Africa region. And equally, the social is made up of both the public and the private. There has been some literature on, you know, what we mean by the public space in the MENA region, but, you know, and from actually on this point, I would be interested to see your thoughts and any literature that you know. Please point me to relevant literature. But I think the first element is that very obviously we're talking about what is social, about the social dimension of life, not economic growth, not the politics of the region. We're talking about the social, and that the social exists both in the public and private domain. So the family, right, which has been probably the most dominant social space, traditionally speaking, in this region, is problematized. We're asking questions about what the public, you know, what is the public domain, who sort of is in charge of developing the public domain. Obviously, there is a policy angle to thinking about this concept. So immediately we have to think about the role of the state. What does the state do in the social sphere? And how does the state relate to the government? And where does policy making come in? And policy making is a very practical thing. Okay, it's the nuts and bolts of how a society runs. So it's very pragmatic. It's beyond revolutions, and it's beyond protests, and it's beyond political squabbling. It's about the day-to-day access to health, education services, to, you know, adequately paid jobs, a decent life. So I think that emphasis on policy, right, the practical dimension, the practical path to actually reaching all these ideals of social justice and poverty reduction. So that's the other part of the interest for me in this concept. And equally, because we're talking about society and state and social policy, then inevitably we do need to think about civil society as well, and the non-state sector. I mentioned the family before, but the fact that public action can take a variety of forms. Okay, and then finally, that another big component of what the social might be or what the nation state might be is the market and the business sector. And you may think, okay, so that's the whole of society. Well, yes, in a way, this is what is of interest. This is what makes this concept interdisciplinary, and which can draw in a variety of perspectives, and which means that the emphasis really is on whatever country you happen to be looking at. So it's quite a national focus, I guess, but it de-emphasizes to a certain extent what international development organizations might be doing. The focus is on what might the state be doing, how does it fit in with the other aspects of society. And what social policy is for, traditionally there have been two sort of overarching perspectives. The most dominant one is thinking about redistribution. Okay, so we are concerned about an equal distribution of resources in society, access to public services, adequate wages, again, and these link in directly to issues of social justice and poverty. But equally, there is a very strong element of how you build a society and social cohesion, and how you recognize people's rights and different claims to different aspects of the state. So it's a very broad concept. We aren't just talking about development in the traditional sense of, okay, how do we, we need economic growth, we need to be competitive globally. We're talking about the way in which a society is constructed, not just to make things difficult or to think in a very idealistic way, but because in the end, historically, in any country around the world, okay, there has to be some kind of perspective on how that society will operate and what vision there is for it. So interest and discussion of social policy can go in quite different directions, and is very directly linked to nation building, okay, to the kinds of issues that certainly a country like Lebanon has been grappling with and lacking in. And it's these sort of the two sort of twin focus of redistribution and recognition. But thirdly, and this is an element which, maybe it's a kind of a double-edged sword, that social policy can be about all these great things, all about social justice and access to services and equal rights and citizenship, but because it is about how the different institutions of society sit together, and because there are moral judgments made about, well, who are the poor and how should we help them, and who is entitled to social security, and on what basis should people access services, then there is a judgment which is made about what kind of society we are in, and therefore some kind of element of social control. And we see this in various ways in different countries. Typically, for example, increasingly in many Western countries, you may have heard that if you are unemployed and you need to claim a state benefit, then particularly the Anglophile type countries, so UK, US, or Australia, will make your payment from the state either conditional on whether or not you've already been paying your social insurance, or whether or not you are actively looking for a job, okay? And that's the idea that there is an element of social control involved. But again, the emphasis is on the fact that it's what kind of society do we want to live in, okay? And, these are perhaps questions that don't really interest business elites, okay? The freer the market, the more open the society, the better. And then you just leave, social issues to the family, to women in the family, and then, that's the situation sorted. But obviously, I think that there's enough research out there, enough arguments to show that that's not really a winning argument. So that's sort of generally just thinking broadly about social policy as an idea. The research that I've been able to do for the last few years has tried to sort of adapt some of these concepts, starting from Lebanon, but broadening out into other countries in the region, and sort of eventually now looking on the region as a whole to think about, okay, well, fine, these may be countries with certain political problems, with some big social challenges of youth unemployment or famine, or, well, not quite famine, but undernourishment or conflict. Okay, but there are still systems of social policy and welfare provision in these countries whether just in the constitutions or in practice, there are health systems, there are education systems, there are social security systems, there are subsidies, food or fuel subsidies. So there are particular structures in place which are meant to provide access to services to local populations. And the research has been focused on, well, what are these systems achieving? You know, are they helping people access services, right? So it's the kind of issues that we don't often get to talk about. And one aspect of it was looking at the religious dimension. Hopefully you won't switch off when I say this. But inevitably at the time, you know, to work in Lebanon, and because I was looking at civil society organizations, they were essential to understanding the local makeup, the institutional makeup of who provides what, and you know, the role of the religious NGO sector. And in many ways, this is not irrelevant. If we look historically at how, you know, the really fantastic welfare states developed in Western Europe, to a certain extent in North America. North America probably does not have a fully fledged welfare state. But, you know, I may be going back 200, 300 years, but you have to start somewhere. And religious organizations, primarily Christian groups or Jewish groups, were very prominent at the start of the democratic process and the development of civil society. You know, and this was well documented by the research of Alexis de Tocqueville in North America, for example, and it was taken up by some of the historical sociologists like Tida Skocpol, in the, you know, more contemporary writers. And in the UK, there is a group of authors who look at the importance of sort of the foundations of welfare provision that the churches in the UK, for example, developed. So looking at the religious dimension is relevant for a variety of reasons, and very much relevant for social welfare action. And today, in the British context, for example, you know, the religious organizations have come back with force. So the research looked at that, and then what we've been doing in Lebanon was going a little bit beyond kind of describing what's happening in Lebanon, which was something probably a bit too ambitious on my part, but thankfully it's ended fairly well, and Hannah can tell you that we were trying to bring together key decision makers, so really making this idea of social policy something that can inform social action and public policy as much as it can issues of social justice. And there were sort of workshops bringing together a variety of actors within the field in Lebanon to try to evaluate and think together. So what are we achieving? You know, how are we reducing poverty? How are we working together? You know, and you know, at least we've done it, and perhaps over time, you know, a bit more pestering and a bit more sort of meetings, things might change. But certainly, you know, at least it's helped to keep discussion of this topic alive. And there are some very interested people within Lebanon, at least, who are very active in this field and perhaps who share some of our frustrations as well. I'd like to alert you as well to, and again, just referring to the way in which interest in social policy is beyond, beyond the mainstream academic. You know, I've done the research, I'm going to write the journal paper or write the book, but that this is very real for a lot of us, which is that last year we established the IPR MENA Social Policy Network at the University of Bath with some funding from the Council for British Research in the Levant. And the idea is to really give flesh to this concept. So at the moment, we're sort of building, so the website, obviously you can visit it. There is a mailing list which is made up of, you know, non-governmental organizations, researchers, PhD students, undergraduate students who are interested in social policy issues. We've been lucky that we organized one conference last year, and we have another one in next week again, which for this year. And there's a variety, there's a blog, there's a mailing list, a JISC mail, it's called, and you can subscribe to that if you like. But it's really and a virtual library, which we're very proud of. So you can go onto the virtual library and have a look at the different kinds of publications that are available within this field. So basically sort of trying to really make this topic a reality, both as a concept and as a concept that informs action, whether we are at the academic level or whether we are at the policy level. So in what way has there been change? In what way have things been different? I'm sure you're all aware of and familiar with a lot of the international development discourse, perhaps. Yes, no, partly. And this is a question that I'm still, I haven't found an answer to. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Perhaps later we can talk about this. That in what way is social policy different to development? And I think that's an important question because then we can analyze. Can we analyze things differently, and therefore can we try and inform government action differently? At the start, when I focused on the local context, the state, the role of the state, the role of civil society, the role of the social and the pragmatic aspects of public policy, it was because I think that those are important distinguishing features between the development policy discourse and the social policy discourse. And I think that this is probably, obviously, a distinction that needs to be further developed and sort of partly explains, I was saying to this lady earlier, that most of my research over the last several years has been, concentrated in some of the poorest parts of Beirut and around Lebanon, visiting the different ministries and feeling very demoralized. But that's where I've spent all of my time, and maybe not purposefully, but in a sense, really, I never really met with any, of the big development agencies. I may have met with sort of the World Bank, one or two times, or UNDP, but they were not of interest to me. I was interested in the Lebanese government, and I was interested in the Lebanese civil society organizations, because coming from a social policy perspective, I'm looking at what the public policy apparatus can do for issues of social justice. And again, you may think, well, what will that lead to? We've done that all before. We know that it won't work. Well, there is an interest in social protection now, and I guess I've come around full circle in the sense that I'm now having to engage, in a sense, more with some of the donor agencies and development organizations, because sadly, they are pushing this agenda slightly, okay, because they're interested in social protection, so it's become popular. So I have sort of gone full circle now, and I'm sort of having more meetings in luxurious cafes, in this part of the city. And that actually reflects the reality, the way the world works. Okay, but nevertheless, I think that the emphasis has to remain on a local effort somewhere. So these are things to think about. So just to sum up some of the previous things I've been saying, I think that there is a very obvious, there's an intuitive appeal to the idea of social policy because we all want social justice, and we want to do something about poverty reduction. We want equal access to the resources of the state and citizenship rights and all of these great things. And possibly some of you may be familiar with the literature around, Islamic political movements and the social welfare that they provide, is really critical, and that it's a kind of a backdoor into understanding Islamic terrorism. That literature exists. I don't think that a lot of it, where social welfare has been mentioned, there is very little empirical research, in-depth empirical research. There's a few studies that have come out in the last 10 years that really do empirical research among Islamic movements and Islamic organizations and focus on the social services and social welfare element. But equally, there's a lot of assumptions in the literature that Islamic social movements are using welfare to get votes and to establish a political an Islamic state, and it's all about political Islam. So I think there's a bit more balance that's needed in that literature and a bit more context into looking at the role of social welfare. But nevertheless, that's also an obvious reason, certainly for some donor agencies, for some governments, as to why we need to look at social welfare. I hope that's not too controversial, but I had to say it because this is the reality. So the flip side of all of this, and I've sort of been saying this at the beginning, is that we've overlooked that actually these countries do have welfare systems. Okay, I think I've already said this before. The MENA countries do have education systems. They do have health systems. They do have social services. And the idea is, well, what do they provide? And how could these provide a foundation for future development of some kind of reform of social policy structures, but that equally these are important, and that if we are going to build some kind of research or public policy agenda which is focused on issues of social justice, then it is important to recognize that the region is not working in a vacuum. And even if countries depend on oil money and use oil money to spend on health and education, well, there are examples elsewhere in the world where money has been invested into sovereign funds in a sensible way, in Norway, for example, and that, there are other ways of using this. So I guess I'm trying to keep an open mind and keeping a long sense of history that change will not happen over time, but it has to start somewhere. So what are the enabling conditions for social policy? Yes, a strong state, some sense of the public good, and a common good. I think these are essential axes. The rule of law, okay? You can't have a proper institutions that respect citizenship rights and that guarantee welfare rights if you can't enforce the law. I think it's very important to move away from a poverty-focused, targeted approach to development or social policy, and to think about a society as a whole and to think about processes of social inequality. And I'm not the first person who said this. There's lots of great people and researchers out there who've been saying this for at least 60, 70 years. And equally, there is evidence. There's been a lot of interesting, some quite important reports by UNRIST, for example, who look at different country examples, and the evidence is there. The most advanced countries on the planet have had some form of universal social welfare provision, and this is what helped to reduce poverty dramatically. Western Europe for certain, but that again, that some kind of social cohesion and some kind of taxation system that can support all of that is important. And equally, obviously, some focus on developing human capacities. Okay, so the local population, preserving them, not the kind of hemorrhage and brain drain that Lebanon has. So, in a way, therefore, you can talk about social services and social justice in a variety of different ways. It can serve a political function, yeah? So no self-respecting political party or ruling party can afford to ignore public services, okay? Once you get to power, the route to power might be public services, and equally, once you are in power, you have to provide public services. So that's the kind of the political function that social policy might support. There is an economic function, and this sort of accepts the fact that we live in a capitalist world, and social policy is there to balance out the impact of the capitalist system, whether it's through social safety nets if people lose their jobs, but that equally, education, developing human capital is a good way as well to develop the economy. And maybe the least popular function, which is probably the real social justice function, is that social policy is good just in its own right, that it's good because it's important to recognize social equality is important, equity is important, and that it's a part of the social contract. But in the MENA region, what we find primarily is that there is this instrumental perspective towards social policy, which is, the economic and the political function, that you provide public services as a function of being an employee in part, but equally, because sometimes you may want to take care of people after they've fallen out of the system, or simply provide safety nets for those who have no income and who are living in poverty. Okay, I'm going to try to make time on this, yeah? So I think, so the debate is really shifting in a variety of different directions. When we talk about social protection, are we protecting people against risk? Or are we respecting their rights? Or are we satisfying their basic needs? So there's a variety of directions in which the debate is going. And at the moment, I think with some donor agencies, it's not yet clear what they are focusing on, but the dominant view is probably the World Bank view at the moment, which is this sort of risk resilience, yeah? So you target poor people because they are risk averse, they don't know how to protect themselves, or they cannot deal with economic or social shocks, and you do that through safety nets and cash transfers. So that's where a lot of the money is. There's a lot of goodwill, you know, for human rights and basic needs, but the money and the programs are in the number one, you know, you just sort of protect against risk and you improve resilience. Okay, and a World Bank report came out not long ago about this. And since the Arab Spring, what we've seen is a little bit of sort of more of the same, really. So Middle East and North African countries have tended to have this focus on targeting and social safety nets, and really the really sort of universal type of provision, apart from, if you like, primary education, or maybe in some countries primary health, has been subsidies, food and fuel subsidies. And some countries did more of these, you know, with the protests starting. It was a way perhaps of dampening down the anger and the protests in the street. Some countries like Bahrain have started to introduce an unemployment insurance scheme, but which is very, very limited and very restricted, but really targets university graduates and has some interesting criteria. But really piecemeal changes. So the revolution on the streets has not been matched by a revolution in social thinking yet. And you can see the social safety net perspective in some spending, in sort of estimates of spending. There are various estimates. I'm just using this one from the World Bank, which will show you that this is the expenditure on social assistance, which is highest in the MENA region. So the MENA region spends a lot on subsidies and safety nets, and much, much less on the more long-term permanent forms of social protection, like social insurance, like universal health, like universal education, okay? Because we have a mentality of rentierism, benevolence, charity, yeah? Leave the rest to the family. But that does not mean that coverage rates are great. You know, one interesting report that the World Bank brought out a couple of years ago has quite an interesting review of subsidies, and obviously you may already be familiar with it, and the World Bank is advocating very strongly for the end of subsidies, probably for very obvious, you know, the usual efficiency arguments. But there is the evidence there that coverage rates are not great. So a lot of money is being spent, but actually is it reaching, you know, the poorest segments of society, and what are the levels of coverage? There are some good examples in West Bank and Gaza, for example, where the program is run by UNRWA, and that has been sort of verified, and it's good evidence to show that it does have a much higher rate of coverage. And in terms of programs, what I can see is, you know, the real development, you know, any big development, certainly in Lebanon. You may have heard of the National Poverty Targeting Program. But, you know, this, you know, cash transfers just seem to be not quite the magic bullet, but certainly it's sort of the darling of a lot of development policy discourse now, both for their sort of good effects on, you know, purchasing power and consumption, smoothing type of impact. But equally, there's some interesting research talking about the psychosocial effects of cash transfers. Although the evidence from Latin America, where a lot of these programs started, is not conclusive. Brazil, for example, may have done better than Mexico, and that there were unintended consequences to some of these policies. But it seems that cash transfers are sort of the next important thing to do. Lebanon is not necessarily interested in direct cash transactions, and there are sort of other proposals to give perhaps vouchers for food or to have access to basic resources. But really, does this, really sort of serve the purpose? And is this really what we need? When we talk about some, comprehensive social justice, fair enough, perhaps cash transfers can satisfy some immediate basic needs, of those living in, maybe under $3 a day or something along those lines. But, are they the building blocks of the future? So really not much has changed in a way. It's a little bit of more of the same, plus a lot more political conflict. And at the time where there continues to be duplication and wastage of resources, so the kinds of things that we often hear about, particularly high levels of informal labor. I'm sure you're aware of this, very high levels of out-of-pocket health spending. This is the region probably with one of the highest levels of out-of-pocket health expenditure, with over 50% of the population, having to pay for their own health care. And, this is not a poor region. Most countries are of a good level of income, if not a very high level of income per capita. But equally, there are instances of undernourishment. I think around 70% of food in the MENA region is imported, okay? And a very high level of informality in the labor sectors, in the agricultural sector. So, possibly this may be going back decades, but, are there solutions there in developing the agricultural sector a bit more? Immediate policy reforms. I think we hear a lot from policymakers that it's, certainly in Lebanon, that, you can't really reform anything, you can't really propose anything concrete or long-term because the country is consistently facing crises, the newest one being the Syrian refugees. And, the really unstable political situation makes it very hard to move away from a humanitarian response mode. And yes, fair enough, I think to a certain extent, you can sort of see the arguments for that. But equally, there are some short-term reforms, that a lot of housekeeping type changes and internal governance restructuring that could well be feasible, and fiscal space could be found if some reprioritization of spending and better sort of accounting took place. So I think that it's important not to give up immediately, because the long-term changes we want and the long-term effects we want are not possible within this sphere. And this is the public policy element. Okay, so if you remember right at the start, I said it's interesting because there's a social element, there's a public policy element. And perhaps there are immediate short-term reforms that may happen that can, at least put in place some better institutional structures. And other countries are doing it. I think South Africa is an interesting place to look to. South Africa has, I think, very similar problems to this region. It had an apartheid system, which in some ways was worse to, the sectarian system that exists in Lebanon. Had very high youth unemployment. It still has high youth unemployment, very high social and income and economic inequalities. But they've, changes happened, and of course problems remain. But there are really significant changes, and South Africa is one country that's really taking on board a lot of this, social policy discourse and actively integrating that into government public policy. I mentioned Norway earlier. I think, I'm sure there are better things we can do with oil money, and this argument is tried and tested. India remains, probably one of the most contradictory countries in the world in terms of, levels of employment and skills and poverty and economic growth. But equally, basic things like the right to work, the right to food, the right to information campaigns. Okay, these really affected the poorest agricultural workers in the country. Why don't MENA countries do something like that, I ask? But so basically, there are other things happening elsewhere. Maybe we're constantly hitting the brick wall of political will. Who knows? So yesterday in one of the workshops, we were sort of falling into two groups of who's an optimist and who's a pessimist. And, I'm happy to remain an optimist for now. I take a very long view of history, and I think change can happen. It probably might happen slowly, but, I don't think I think change would happen, but it may take a long time, but it has to happen sometime and somewhere. And so far, so good. That's just my logic. So I think what's nice about social policy is that we are looking at local institutional processes, and we are looking at the local society. So it's a little bit of a kind of an anthropological perspective, perhaps, but I would say more it's a historical institutionalist perspective, which is where I probably locate myself a little bit more. And so there are strong roots both in sort of sociology and in political science. I think what's interesting about social policy is the question of, we hear a lot about solidarity, but I think it isn't just about solidarity. It's important to ask the question of responsibility. Who is responsible for, the context, for who is responsible for providing rights, and who is responsible for whatever situation the country finds itself in. This is a very controversial point. We began a discussion yesterday. We may well continue it today. I do not think that religiously based social welfare should be ruled out. I shall leave it there, but we can probably have this discussion later on because I should finish. And I do think it's very important to move away from, the focus on poverty. And, we live in a capitalist world. We've always lived in a capitalist world for a long time. But the neoliberal push, I think, is the biggest challenge. I think this is perhaps one of the biggest issues that we need to look to. So when we think about social justice, it isn't just related to the political circumstances of the MENA region. There is a wider global market economy where there are particular things happening. Rich countries like the UK and US were badly hit by the global economy. So I think that there's a reality out there which is, broader than the reality in this region. So just to end, social policy matters because it's a program of research. I think that's probably fairly clear. It's certainly a program for public policy. And I think that perhaps what's even more interesting is that it's something that affects us very directly, and that perhaps in very small ways we may be directly involved in, whether we are receiving services or whether we are on the streets fighting for those services. And that's it. Thank you very much. And please join the network. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jawad, first of all, for accepting our invitation on such a short notice, and for such a great discussion on the research. I mean, the longevity of your research brings a lot of value also and insight into what's going on in Lebanon and in the region as well. I'm glad, that today's talk goes in more depth than yesterday's talk. And it seems to me that when we talk about social policies in this region, we have to acknowledge the fact that families and religious groups and religious organizations play a key role in that. And we can't really, it's probably not just specific to our region, it's probably global, but it's more obvious or evident in this region. But families probably cannot bear that responsibility. Again, you mentioned the issue of responsibility towards the end of your talk. Probably families cannot bear that responsibility as much as before. It could be because of the changing geopolitical situation in the region. It could be because of the changing economy. There may be many factors. But you also mentioned the issue of the need for a strong state for these changes in the social policies. And I think in this, again, a personal opinion, it may not be based on any research per se, but I think we still have a long way to go to get to that strong state and that political will that will really shift the way social policies are structured in this region. And I agree with you, we do need immediate policy reform, especially now that we in Lebanon are, welcoming all the large numbers of Syrian refugees. I think we have added concerns in terms of social policies now that we have to address. Thank you very much. I will open it up to questions and if you have any comments to make as well. We're going to take a question in the top and then we're going to go. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for your interesting. I'd like to ask you, how come, since you were interested in the Lebanese government, how could you advocate or promote your issue? How did they welcome it? Did you have advocates? Did you motivate them? Did they respond to you? Did you form a coalition in Lebanon advocating for the social policy? How were you supported in Lebanon? How were you welcomed or not welcomed?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the funny thing about Lebanon is that people, will belong to, opposing political factions, but they will still have each other's phone numbers and they will still meet at workshops and they will still talk about social welfare. So I think there are sort of two parts to your questions in a sense that I tried very much, not with no presumptions, but it's nice, when you do policy-related research to engage with, ministers, advisors, or to try to meet the minister. And I think generally Lebanon is small and quite sociable, and most people will meet you and will talk to you, and will tell you that they're doing what they can, but obviously the level of honesty might vary, and how well they've known you might vary. I don't think there's enough. With some ministries that I've visited, sometimes they themselves are not clear what their strategy is. So I think sometimes it's very hard to have a really in-depth conversation and to really sort of get to the nitty-gritty. So I think generally, and I'm sure you've probably come across this, ministry officials, public officials will meet you, they'll talk to you, they'll describe what's going on. But at the end of the day, they'll say to you, this is what we can do. There's a political conflict going on. We're a weak country. So I think the usual kinds of arguments that, are very, we've all heard of them now. I think that, I'm coming as a researcher. I'm sort of a mixture of British and Lebanese. So I don't think I've been able to bring together any coalition. Far from it, and I don't belong to any political faction, so it's maybe very hard to have more leverage. But I think that there's been interest. I think whenever we've set up workshops, and I've done a few now over the years, people do attend and they do share information. I think the reality remains that the World Bank. Some of the UN agencies, obviously maybe I'm not sure how involved the IMF is, but definitely the World Bank and the UN agencies are really sort of the guardians of public policy and social policy agenda from the government side. The NGO sector is quite independent and they do their own thing. And again, they come along and they might complain about the situation. So, a couple of years ago, there was a national social strategy. And again, that was, very much a kind of a UN agenda. But then, ironically, that's opened up the space, because these donor agencies, some of them are interested in engaging with researchers. So, UNESCO or UNRIS now, for example, is more interested in the MENA region. So that's why possibly, maybe in another decade or so, we might see some further changes. But I'm a researcher, and I think it's very, this is our identity, and that's our strength, that, that we do independent research, and there are different ears to listen. Yeah.
We don't have the key people. We don't know the
Well, yeah, I think there are key people that come and go, but the extent to which they are able to bring about, really fundamental change, I don't know how that will happen. I think the emphasis remains quite, dealing with crises, maintaining the status quo. So we talked a lot about this yesterday, the Syrian refugees issue. For me, that's just yet another political problem in the region, okay? So it isn't just an issue of a crisis of displaced or refugee people. There's a much broader, well, this is symptomatic, this is ongoing. The context is crisis, yeah? And now, the government is sort of scrambling, how do we deal with this issue? But this is, but it just seems...
I just want, before we go to the next question, I just want to make a comment. You repeatedly said that I'm a researcher and this is what I do, and it's very interesting that yes, what you do is very valuable, but I think what is very valuable is also trying to translate this work into something meaningful that the policymakers can then take and kind of run with and say, okay, we can adopt or we can take some of these recommendations to implement. And I think this is, I really can't say if this is the role of the researcher in this case, or think tanks, or civil society, or advisors, or whose role specifically is it, but it's interesting.
It's the role of the academic, maybe, in the sense that for me it's important that this is recognized as an academic subject as well, where, and I sound very old now, where the next generation of PhD students and postdocs will take up, and I don't want to sound too idealistic, but I think a revolution in knowledge can happen. And again, maybe it will take a long time, but I think that there are more and more people who are entering this field. If 5 to 10 years time, our generation probably, if they inherit or are elected, will be in government. And I think it's if there is a new breed of researchers and public intellectuals or whoever it is who are engaged in these issues, I think the tide can change. And I've seen it changed. And I've seen it change since, 2000, 1999. I'm sure people who are older than me in this room who've been around, but perhaps you feel it's deteriorated. In Lebanon, we hear a lot about the 1950s, being the global era, or the odd politician who's come into government. Maybe, but I think there's a responsibility related to knowledge production, and we live in an information society, don't we? So anyway.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I have so many points. You excited so many ideas in my mind. So I'm really hard put to find out where to start. But I should start by contradicting you. You mentioned, I think, twice that you were very old. Where does that put me and the gentleman over there? I mean, this is... So
hopefully I will have a long life, but this birthday that I have coming up,
but I disagree, you're not very old.
I'm joking.
You very rightly propose that one should embark on long-term social policy research. What would you, isn't that what you're canvassing for? And wouldn't it be right to start by the premise that the mayhem that we are witnessing in this region, the catastrophes that we are witnessing all around, is a direct result of poor social policy? I think that if we acknowledge that, we can start doing things the right way. Number two, what tools do you propose that one might use for this research? I think this is worth dedicating another presentation, another talk perhaps, and I think it would be essential to take into account new technology and what it offers. Thirdly, on the issue of the role of religious NGOs, I would beg to differ here because social establishments are geared primarily towards prolonging their existence, towards maintaining the status quo, towards, I don't know, it's essentially keeping things the way they are from their own perspective at least. And it seems to me that in many cases, I'm not talking only about Muslim NGOs, but, or any particular sect within Muslim NGOs, but it would seem to me that this might be counterproductive. I'll leave it at that. There are so many points that you raised that I don't want to take too much of my colleagues' time. Thank you. And I just want to mention that I come from the pure sciences, and I'm here to atone for my sins for having not paid enough attention to the importance of social science. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's great. So we can speak across disciplines. So, no, absolutely. I think I mentioned at some point that sadly it took the Arab uprisings to wake governments and develop, donor agencies up to the importance of social protection, social justice. So of course I agree with you, but I wanted to give you the context and evidence. So I think your conclusion hopefully tells me that I've given a meaningful presentation, because you came to the conclusion that I was hoping for. Sorry?
That's what I put down here.
Yeah, that's great. So it means we're on the same wavelength. On the social policy tools, I wasn't clear. Do you mean the actual policies and programs?
I think you meant methodology-wise.
Sorry?
Or research methodology, you mean?
Yes,
in terms of tools.
Whenever you embark on a research project, you have to have some kind of premise. And I'm not saying that this premise may not be contradicted. Of course, it could very well be wrong. But I think the premise we should start with is that we have had a dismal and absolute imperial failure in all aspects of social policy in this region.
Okay, I mean, yeah.
I know you may hesitate to agree, but that's I'm expressing my own personal opinion.
Yeah, no, I think so. Maybe there are degrees. Yeah, I think you see, some people may argue that this region has a lot of social capital. Okay, very strong community, society-based networks. You may even argue that clientelism and patronage are forms of social capital as well. But I think that's why we have to look at the social changes. That even the family is changing. The family is no longer, for a variety of reasons, able to take care of members who are not in employment or that kind of thing. But I think, so I think we agree, but there are...
But even that has failed. Even the safety network provided by families has failed.
Well, exactly, it's changing,
I mean, this is why people from northeastern Syria, faced with drought, faced with soil salinity, had to emigrate, had to migrate to around the major cities, to relatives, and then that network failed as well. And what do they have left?
That's what we need. We need more, we need more social scientists, we need more sociologists. Political scientists looking at the region beyond voting.
This is particularly a problem we have in terms of research. We had the president, I think, of the Arab Council for Social Sciences at a workshop just a couple of days ago, and she was talking about the need for more social science researchers in this region, and that we tend to have that tendency of directing our children into the sciences like biology, chemistry, etc.
What we call STEM,
Yes, and rather than the social sciences, because we do still have that perception and belief in the region that this will not earn you any money, it will not get you a good job. And so if you hear, like for example, my nephew just finished high school a couple of years ago, and he went into psychology, and you should just see the grandparents and how they're freaking out that This boy who has very good grades but decided to go into psychology. I mean, what would you work? How much will you earn? My goodness, we can't imagine. So this is still the mentality in this region, and so that takes us into another discussion, I understand. But again, yes, we do need more social science researchers. And
to monopolize the discussion, this is the last intervention I should be making, but I think this leads one into considering the tools that one has to use. We have to acknowledge that in many instances, in many countries, social research is almost punishable. It is a swear word in some countries. And so we have to invent new tools. We have to really institute, a paradigm change in that respect.
I think some of the Gulf countries are quite conservative, so they tend to focus around family policy and supporting the family and doing things, research on the family. I'm sure you've heard of various research centers that have, been established in various countries. But social policy will draw on political economy, so it will draw on cultural studies, it will draw on social policy is not a discipline, it's a subject area because it's interdisciplinary. So research methodologically, you can do purely quantitative research and you can do purely qualitative, and there are a variety of ways. It depends on what you study, but the focus always has to be what's the end result? Are these people better off? Do they have access to services? Are they living in dignity? Are they free? So it's the kind of ideals that we all want for ourselves. I think finally on the point of religious organizations, we can go on forever. This may be an argument of desperation on my part, but having gotten my hands dirty and done the empirical research, both in this context and even in the UK, because I do a lot of research on faith-based organizations in the UK as well. I do think, and maybe we're a long way away still from this, but I think that it is, and I said this yesterday, I think that there is a civic dimension to social services, which we need to disentangle from the politics, and it is possible to do that. And religion has been around for thousands of years, for the whole of human history. It's not going to disappear. The idea is that if you have a strong state, and you have the rule of law, and you have the democratic institutions, then there can be proper participation from the business sector, from the civil society sector, from the family. So, and it's in that sense that I mean that it cannot be written off.
We'll take a couple more questions. Okay. Yes, Valeria.
In your opinion, what are the components of a good state or a strong state? How can it enter the social science researcher?
I think there are. It's a kind of sort of debates that we've heard about. You need an independent state. You need an independent judiciary that punishes the rich as it does the poor, as the powerful as the not powerful. You need a separation from the state administration and the state apparatus from the government and the political parties. Yeah, so these need to be separate. I mean, obviously the sectarian system in Lebanon is doing nobody any good, but we've heard that many times before. So I think the rule of law, because if you're going to respect rights, if you're going to have anything called citizenship, you need the rule of law. I mean, I think probably our problem is, this might sound a little bit cliched, but it's if you are a nation state, in the proper sense of the word, then there are some dimensions of modernity that need to be reflected in that. But we are, Lebanon is a society. We said this yesterday. There is a government, but we don't really have a state because we haven't got a developed sense of our institutions that they are independent. We don't have independent judiciaries and independent bureaucracy and a legislature and executive and all of those different components. So I think that, you know, it's a problem of being of not becoming quite maybe a modern nation state. I'm not saying that we should all be that and that's the best way to be, and nation states have been oppressive and have done all kinds of things. But this is the world that we live in, and we have just a real mishmash of, you know, all kinds of allegiances, plus, oh, okay, we're also a country called Lebanon, you know, and you know, it may be a result of colonization or mandate or bad development or the elites being sort of in power, you know, for 50, 60 years, if not longer. So we have a real mishmash. Yeah, I said something controversial yesterday that, you know, in Lebanon, you know, we love being like the French. So why don't we really be like the French and have a French revolution? But this should not go on YouTube. I'm very sorry. But yes.
Keep up with this intention, and this will...
No, it's not. No, I mean, you know, I think at the end of the day, you know, we're doing research. I think, you know, whatever arguments we want to propose, you know, it's important to do that on the basis of research, to be objective. But I think that there are genuine frustrations for everybody, whether you live inside this region or out of it. You know, and it just seems that, you know, it's constantly, you know, an explosive situation. But people, you know, people's lives are being lost. And I don't think that's normal or fair. Anyway.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'm not with the revolutions because we've seen in other countries that it hasn't really worked very well. Perhaps maybe Tunisia is doing better than the other countries, but yeah, I don't like my voice being very loud. So I'm not with you on this point. I think we should increase our participatory mechanisms more and stay in the streets and demonstrate, because at the end of the day, I think people will be heard. So first of all, thank you for the overview. I'm sorry I didn't say that before. I understood that you associated or related the issue of justice with the redistributive policy, but I think it's much more than that. It's about respect for rights, it's about equity, equality, and participation. So from your own point of view, how would you define and measure social justice in general?
How do we define social justice?
Yeah, social justice. And what would be the best framework for measuring it in this region particularly? And how much do you think we have the ability as a region to reach there? I know it's a very, very difficult and controversial question, but I would love to hear your opinion. So what would be the prerequisites to promote social justice when we are now talking about new MDGs and new sustainable development goals? Do you think already governments who are already burdened with these international commitments will be ready to rally to address social issues, also when more pressing concerns such as wars and radical Islamism is threatening stability in the region? Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Can I just clarify? So your point about revolutions, are you saying that people should stay in the streets or should not?
No, of course, but they should not do the bloody revolutions and the...
Okay.
You know,
Can we take the next question so we can
wrap up?
without a proper agenda. I mean, like what happened in Egypt, for example. There wasn't a really proper or vision for what will happen after the transition, and this is why the revolution failed in some way. We got the Islamic people in power and then Sisi in power, so there wasn't really a good vision of what is needed after the ousting of Mubarak.
Right.
Thank you for this interesting lecture, Dr. Jawad. I have a question. Do you think in the MENA region in particular, do we need to create separate family policies, or we can just amend the existing social policies to meet the increasing needs of the families? Thank you. What do you mean by separate family? Like family policies, independent family policies, just a family policy, not a social policy that is aimed at family.
Right, okay. Oh,
Yes, go ahead.
okay. Right, thank you. No, okay, I mean, very quickly on the point of revolutions, no, I'm not using that term lightly at all. I think I'm just reflecting on the fact that social action has happened outside on the streets, and maybe thinking about myself, you know, where do I stand in all of that, and that I think a change, and actually this is a view in some of the literature, that you can bring about change in two ways. You know, you can bring it through education, or you can bring it through protest, and for a variety of reasons I choose the path of education, okay? But equally, I'm not dismissing the fact that, you know, revolutions are bloody, but equally, I don't think that rights are won here in this room. And for women's rights, we're not won. I don't know if you're aware, there's a very famous, I've forgotten her name, but there was a very famous British women's rights activist in the 19th century. She was celebrated about a year ago. It was the anniversary of her death. And because, you know, her fight for women's rights, what she did was, you know, the race courses, the British have all these racing and all the elites go there. She walked into the race course, into the, you know, the line, the run, you know, the horses that were running. It was around some king's time. It was about 200 years ago, and she died. And it was a way of bringing attention to women's rights. I'm not romanticizing this. But I think human history is made up of such events, you know, and of course I'm not inciting anything, but what I'm saying is that there is a reason for all of these different actions and change. There are different ways in which change happens, and of course loss of life is always a shame, but there are always reasons for this, and obviously I won't go into the Egyptian revolution, why it's whatever's happened and has it gone full circle. So I think for me it's a revolution in knowledge and in education, and I do my bit within the university context and within people I come across with, and you know, and I think that, you know, if we can develop a research base which is empirical, you know, that I think we are arming ourselves with important knowledge. On the social justice issue, there was a slide that I referred to which was about redistribution and recognition. I think the redistribution argument is the classic one, that we have to redistribute resources, and that's what, you know, the workers of the 19th century, you know, that, and actually our labor movements in this region, you know, that's what they were fighting for, that they wanted a share of economic and political power. Perhaps the world has changed. Maybe we're slightly richer, we have a bit more economic security maybe, and we are more interested in issues of gender equality or racial equality or religious equality, and that's the recognition argument, that social justice is about, you know, you just, what you said, respecting people's different values, different identities, and that actually that matters a lot for their well-being and their happiness. Okay, and that's certainly an argument maybe in the more advanced capitalist countries. In terms of how these concepts may be achieved, you know, I wish I had a crystal ball, but I think certainly, you know, that to a certain extent we have a lot of good things happening in this region, and I don't think we should negate that. I think there is still a lot of goodwill. There is still a lot of community level or family support or civil society support. It varies. It is not always out of self-interest. You know, so there are already good things happening, but, you know, there is still a long way to go, and it can happen on a variety of fronts at a government level, equally, you know, as much as it would at a social level. But I think that governance reform can happen in the short run, you know, without necessarily talking about the wider politics of the region. But I think that the key point, and I've mentioned this before, you know, with the geopolitics of the region, we can't run away from that. But the social justice argument is about the push of neoliberalism. Okay, so I think our people's rights as citizens, their access to resources are being jeopardized all over the world because of the global economic market. So that social justice argument, is being fought outside of this country for very different reasons, in different ways, but for the same kinds of reasons. That youth unemployment has sort of reached a record high in across the world. Even in the UK, they're talking about a lost youth. I think that, it's not just the geopolitics and the conflicts of the region and all of this. Lebanon is a 100% capitalist country. Anyway. And the family policy issue, sorry, I should have made a note of that. I think that, family policy is traditionally a very strong part of social policy, and, and the gender literature, and, looking at sort of welfare systems that women support women support the sort of the economy, in a way. So I think that it is important to have, family policy has to be a part of social policy, and there are lots of overlapping issues related to child welfare or women's rights and that kind of thing. I think probably the issue partly in Lebanon is the civic law and the personal status law, and that has inheritance and marriage and divorce and all of that. And I think family, so in that sense, I think that we have to disentangle family policy from the sectarian system. But family policy is very much a part of what social policy is about. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Jawad. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much.
Again.
Okay. See you again.